Ladies and gentlemen, it's that time again. Uh, my name is Tom Munns. For those that don't know me, my esteemed colleague. Is that cool that I say that I call you that, or should I be saying
Well, I
something
don't
the
know.
reverse?
I'm not
Your
sure.
esteemed
Very
colleague.
esteemed.
Sometimes we get pretty steamed. I mean, and our eyes are blowing up outside of our head, is what we're
Yeah,
seeing in this country. Anyway, ladies and gentlemen, for those of you that have followed us before, we started with an introduction to Ron's book. He's the author of the history of federal lands in the United States. The link to the website will be in the comment box below. We did the introductory video originally, and we had so much fun together. We thought, you know what, maybe this is really a great option for people that maybe don't read or have a hard time reading, and maybe just need a little video encouragement. I think it would probably be better stated as an accompaniment to the book. So we encourage you to buy the book. You can buy a copy of the book, The History of Federal Lands in the United States.com. Again, you can click on the link in the comment box. And as we usually do with the videos, we start off with a little review of the last video, which was video 4. Today's video 5. Uh, and so we talked a little bit about it was on I think we covered pages 11 through 17. And so we went into the land grants. We talked about the different acts and the different grants and why the grants were there. And we talked about patents. We talked about the military industrial complex, which is really a mind blower. If you haven't heard a version relating to the way that Ron talks about it, you really need to hear it. We talked about the military industrial complex intact outside of the Constitution, which is another part that you want to pay attention to. We talked about, let's see, the land program never being disbanded. We talk about districts and the pies on what actually happens when we have a territorial government and sections are broken out into individual territories before they become states. And then we talked a little bit more about the administrative agencies. So uh, that's what we talked about in the last video. If you have questions, please make sure that you put those in the comments of wherever this video might be found, whether it's Rumble, whether it's Facebook, whether it's wherever. You can feel free to contact Ron on his contact page, on his contact tab on his website, the history of federal lands in the United States.com. And Ron, today we are starting off on page 16, the Louisiana Purchase, Chapter 2. So I don't know if you want to begin to roll with that or if you want me to start rolling. What is your pleasure, my friend?
Start rolling because we're about. This is where the land program takes a turn right here.
Okay.
And so I'm going to let you guide this because I'm curious as to the questions that as you were reading it, what was your impression? What are the questions that you came up with? So please go ahead.
Well, I was really, and it's kind of funny after reading it twice. I wish I would have committed more to memory, and I probably wish I would have written even more notes than I already did, as well as more questions. But I didn't, and I guess I'm going to have to do that. I was really floored because you learn about the Louisiana Purchase in high school a little bit. They mention Thomas Jefferson. They don't really mention the significance of what happens. They certainly don't mention the sort of strange dichotomy, if you will, of the position that Thomas Jefferson was in when it came to the acquisition of what do you call it, the land acquisition expansion, or
Constitutional gamble.
yeah, there you go, yeah. And so it was really, really interesting to be able to find out that here you had, was it Napoleon? Is that what you said?
Yeah, so the lands that were being sold by France by Napoleon,
Yeah,
he had them. They wanted to sell them for 15 million, right? That's his price for those lands. Of course, France was in a war, so they needed funding for their war machine. And the reason why it's called a constitutional gamble is because the guys that went down there to negotiate the deal, um, they were only authorized to spend 10 million, right? And there was no Thomas Jefferson's problem with, and the reason why it was called the constitutional gamble is because he was constantly worried about whether or not it was constitutional to do what they were doing, right? And because it was Thomas Jefferson, you have to give that idea, you have to give it some legitimacy because we're talking about the guy that wrote the very first Northwest Ordinance. So if we're querying whether or not Thomas Jefferson understood the land program, it's the guy that wrote the very first land ordinance. So if there's a guy that understands the land program in this scenario, it's that guy, right? So him asking the question of, is this constitutional for us to do? Man, I'd take that to the bank and I'd cash the check.
Yeah. So there, so one could consider, well, there is some legitimacy to this. So as the story progresses, I believe, is that Napoleon asks for 15 million. Thomas Jefferson's put in a really strange position because he's only allowed to spend 10. And what happens?
Yep.
He
Well,
spends,
so Livingston and the rest of the guys, they go and they meet with the delegation from Napoleon in France, and they start a deliberation. And these guys, they actually work Napoleon's negotiators down to $10 million. They work him down to that price. Now, they didn't have permission to do it because there was actually no legitimate authorized. Um, I'm sorry, the 15 million is what they worked him down to. They were only authorized to spend 10 million, but they worked them down to 15. Okay, so there's an extra $5 million in there that they were not authorized to spend. Now, it's not because they spent the money that creates the constitutional gamble, as I said previously. The issue was that Thomas Jefferson didn't know whether or not the whole endeavor was even constitutional because the land program wasn't designed for these kind of purchases, right? The land program, as it sat, was only designed for the Northwest Territories. Only. It was never envisioned to go outside of the Northwest Territories. So Jefferson's like, look, guys, if we're going to do this, we better create another land program that's applicable to these areas. And Congress said no. They deliberated for 2 days. They said, no, we're just going to do it because those are our lands. So now in the congressional record is the first time you start seeing the members of Congress going, well, wait a minute. We're going to count these properties that we're acquiring now as our personal property. And we're not going to create new enabling legislation.
but
Work
when
that
you,
out for a moment.
and so the common thought would be, okay, well, if this federal government was created and they were going to be involved in land expansion, in the average view of an average person that's like me that wants to know stuff, we're like, okay, well, it's either under the federal jurisdiction or it's under the state jurisdiction. And if they're going to be expanding, if they're going to be expanding the United States to acquire more territory, then it would have to be under federal jurisdiction, right?
So start with that. Yes, you're right. So start with that and then let's work it out together. So if the inclusion of the land program into the federal constitution was the Northwest Ordinance in Article 4, Section 3, Clause 2, but it only applied to the Northwest Territories.
Mhm.
And Thomas Jefferson is saying, hey, man, we got to make this constitutional. What is he talking about? I will tell you what he's talking about. If the land program is only applicable to that area, then the only way to make it all legal was to create new enabling legislation that applied to the newly acquired territory, Louisiana and the surrounding territory, the whole Louisiana Purchase.
And they
Now,
and Congress said no.
so Congress went in to deliberate the purchase. And when they deliberated the purchase, they took up the constitutionality of it. And Congress decided, well, here's what we're going to do. Instead of passing enabling legislation for the new area, we're just going to apply the old model to it.
which would be an extension of the Northwest Ordinance,
But they
right?
didn't extend it to legislation. There is no legislation extending it.
It was their verbal commitment to do so.
That's right.
Wow, man. Maybe I shouldn't be laughing. Wow. Well, that puts us in a really interesting position.
Uh-huh. Now you understand why the Northwest area, the 11 Western states, are in a bit of a vassal state arrangement.
Mhm. Wow.
That's why.
Wow, that's interesting. So, but I think what I loved about it was that we ended up connecting it from a historical. When I was thinking of myself in high school, I'm like, I didn't care about the Louisiana Purchase. I'm like, oh, this is so boring, and let's just get over it. And it's when you learn about the internal workings, we're talking about it right now, and I'm like envisioning myself as Thomas Jefferson, arguing with Napoleon on or negotiating with him on trying to be able to figure out what we're gonna. I mean, that's a really, really cool thing. I mean, I feel like it's a really cool thing, right? Because we all hear it. Napoleon was this kind of person, and he was this kind of guy, and he did this over there, and we all think that Napoleon was, he's this long distance guy that had nothing to do with us, and come to find
Right.
out, he did, or at
Yeah.
least,
Well, he was singularly focused at the time because he was in war. They were having a war. They were at war. And so he needed fund, and there's some other considerations too. It's like they wanted to broker a deal to protect the Caribbean territories, and they thought the best way to do that would be an alliance with the United States. So at first they didn't think that way, but through negotiation they're like, well, wait a minute, if the United States acquires these territories and they get a good deal on it, what potentially could we get? Well, the United States could potentially have a very powerful navy. And if the Constitution allows them to have a standing navy, it would be a very powerful navy, and they could protect our interest in the Caribbean.
right.
So we get two things out of the deal. We get a protection in our properties in the Caribbean, we get the $10 million, and we get an alliance with the United States.
Well, why wasn't the Caribbean considered part of the insular arrangement? The I mean, weren't the insular the whole insular, unless I have the words wrong. Um,
No, these are insular areas. And the word insular means separate from. And so
right.
all the Caribbean, the Puerto Rico, Guam, they're all insular areas.
Okay. So Caribbean, that they were part of that. It wasn't just Puerto
Yeah.
Rico. Okay.
Well, so the acquisition, our acquisition of Puerto Rico and Guam came at the Spanish American War in the 1900s.
Mhm.
1898, I think is when the war started. Was done by 1901, 1900, 1901. And so that's when we acquired those properties. And so those insular areas, those territories, and those are territorial. They've been territorial, they remain territorial to this
Right.
day. And so they're under the exclusive power of the United States government. And this
Hmm.
is well fleshed out in several different cases, one of them being Balzac, Balzac versus Puerto Rico, or
Which,
versus the United States, Balzac versus the United States. And it fully fleshes out the issue with Puerto Rico's status and compared to the Western United States and the contiguous United States.
mhm.
And initially, in the Downs versus Bidwell case in 1901, it was thought that there would be some difference there. And I don't want to get it too far into the weeds right now because we've got a build up to get there. But
Right.
so that's the whole idea of the insular areas, is that they're separate from the United States.
Right. That's good going forward. So a couple of the notes you had a quote in here about the program consisted of disposing of acquired territory through sale of land. We kind of covered that already. And the state governments would need just enough to engage in administrative activities while the citizen drove the commercial engine through commercial enterprise. Um, the Northwest Ordinance was no longer viewed by Congress as the most efficient manner with which to engage in the program. Is that part of what you were referring to when you said that Congress was going to continue to apply that model? Probably just because they didn't have anything else and they didn't know what else to do. And it seemed like it would
Yeah,
up to that.
Yeah, that's part of the model. So you got the Northwest Ordinance Land Program, and it's a sale of land program. It's a state creation program. It's an economic stimulus program.
Hmm.
So when you view and all you had all these patent programs and all this stuff, there's a whole bunch of things that encompass the land program. So part of that is that's what you're talking about, the economic portion of the model, in which, and you asked a question, is that part what went into this new area? And it's like, well, if they're using that same model and they're moving it into the western states, so from the 95th meridian westward, then the answer to the question is yes, but with a caveat. They kept the model intact, except that there was no, all of these territories were being admitted into the Union when they became states. The previous model was admission into the Confederacy.
Right.
And that's where the difference manifests itself right away.
Because that's where I was going. You said that it dealt with the Louisiana territories in a different manner than it had under the Northwest Ordinance. And my notes on the
Yeah.
side were the toward an admission of the Union style model. Is that right?
Yeah. Admission into the Union as opposed to admission into the Confederacy.
Perfect. And did you just explain that, or do you need to do that again?
No, that's pretty much it. It's gonna be a brain twister for people because they have to understand what the Confederacy was, which I explained in the previous videos. So if you understand what that was, then you'll understand what I'm talking about. And then the Union model, we're gonna talk about that from here going forward,
Yeah.
is the Union model.
And you make that pretty, you go into a lot of detail throughout the book on that. That's awesome. So the other thing I think that was important to remember was that that the one constant theme throughout the journey was policy. And I think since we're dealing with policy today, administrative policy, administrative agencies, the empowered bureaucracy, if you will, um, anytime I see the word policy, I like to be able to see the context that, to understand the context. So it says that so when you talk about the fact that it was about policy, uh, can you kind of go into that just briefly about what you mean by that?
Yeah, so there's multitudes of different policies, but what it comes down to is uh first of all, you have the policy of ownership or disposal. Those are the two policies at question here. Prior to the acquisition of the Louisiana territories, the model that was being utilized was a disposal model under Article 4, Section 3, Clause 2. In the debates at the acquisition of the Louisiana Purchase, when Congress deliberated this for 2 days, and the vote was 24-7, so it was overwhelmingly in favor of this, okay?
Mm.
That is when you see the first debate in Congress regarding an ownership policy. So we go from a disposal policy and then the acquisition of the Louisiana territories, and now the beginning and introduction into an ownership policy.
So if I was going to simplify this, I would say from what we've learned previously is that when we were involved in the land disposal program, it was important for us to understand was when the land was actually meant to be disposed of, it was actually to the citizens, not the state, right?
Yep,
Okay, so
that's
that's a
right.
really, really important thing to hammer down because the understanding would be, the relationship between feds are going to carve it out and give it to the states and whatever. And it was an economic driver, which is the other thing to bring home. The other thing is that they went from the disposal, which means using it as an economic model, or the feds breaking this up into an economic model to allow the citizens to be able to become prosperous in the acquisition of their new land and what they wanted to do in their businesses. They flipped it and they basically decided that they were going to retain ownership of that land and no longer distribute it to the citizens uh, in the name of that economic model. Is that right?
Well, they hadn't decided that entirely. They had just decided they were going to apply the ownership principle, right? And they hadn't fully decided that the ownership principle was the way they were going to go. They just started talking about ownership, and you see it. It was stated very clearly in the congressional debates, in which, I flesh out in the book the two people that were the dominant arguers of this was Webster, from the Webster's dictionary, and Calhoun. Now, John C. Calhoun was the Southern states' intellectual leader, right? And that argument between those two guys is a microcosm of the macrocosm of the debate. So, and it was framed two ways. It's that uh, there is no ownership principle, as opposed to there is now going to be an ownership principle in the future. But for the time being, they were going to take that Northwest Ordinance model, apply it to Louisiana territories, carve them out according to the model, and they just kind of put the ownership principle sort of on the back burner as a future. They were going to apply it in some future sense,
So what
not
was
right
the
away, but in some future sense.
so just to clarify, in case I misunderstand this, what when they were talking about ownership and they weren't really sure, what do you think was going on in their minds relating to what ownership was and what it looked like and for what purpose? Was it for the feds to be able to maintain control and ownership of the land, or was it quite something else? Do you know?
I think what was going on, it looks like to me in the debates in Congress, there were people that started looking at the the acquisition of the territories in the Western United States as an extension of, like, if you buy a house and it has some property, but the property next door is for sale, and you can expand that property and make it even larger. Look at it that way.
Yeah.
Now, in the way that the land program was initially delegated, you wouldn't get that property. That property would be up for sale to another citizen.
Okay.
But
Okay.
the United States government was saying, no, we're just going to acquire that, and we're just going to own it, and we're just going to. That was what they were thinking, and it comes through in the debates. It's not hard. It's not hard to miss it, right? They were saying it just out. You know, those are our lands, the property of the 27 states that were assembled.
Wow. Well, at least we covered one page so far. Well, no, I mean, I think it was important because the Louisiana Purchase is not only, has it's an important part of history that most of us don't know. It's a great journey to kind of go back to kind of really kind of feel what it was like, and I kind of got a feeling of that, which was kind of a cool thing. And to be able to just put that aside, so it would help lay the foundation in going forward. You had talked about the fact that you had found it fascinating that Jefferson was such a central figure and territorial historical accounts aside from Alexander Hamilton. Now, I can't remember if you go into detail on that or if you wanted to expand on that. If you don't, it says, oh, wait, you
Now,
said these two men play pivotal roles. And I find it
the only
interesting
reason why I
because,
bring that up is because wherever Thomas Jefferson talks about the land program, you're just going to want to pay attention.
right. But
You want to pay attention.
it's interesting because people that are learning history kind of would look at Jefferson and Hamilton as, let's just say, relatively opposite in their view,
Yeah,
So,
very much. Well, okay, so Jefferson and Hamilton both had some level of idea that they needed a strong central government, but Hamilton's version of it was more of an authoritarian view, more of an authoritarian ideology
right,
than Jefferson's.
right.
And Jefferson and Aaron Burr, I think, were similar in the way that they looked at it. And so Aaron Burr's the one that shot Alexander Hamilton in a duel, right, in
Mhm.
1804 or whatever. So
So I found a little bit of maybe I found a little confusion in here. Maybe I'm just seeing it now as I'm scanning through there. But when you go through and you talk about John Marshall and to bail out Thomas Jefferson, obviously that dealt with the purchase and things. You mentioned that Jefferson was intimately involved in Congress in the deliberations. John Marshall wasn't even a U.S. representative of 1799 until 1799, and it was his first political position. Um, and then the governor of this means Jefferson was in on the deliberations regarding the extra constitutional lands, and I found that rather interesting. So then you mentioned something about I think it was the first mention of faction in the book so far. I should actually, when I'm talking about your book, I should always mention it and the violence of factions so that people have that connection. But you mentioned something about uh, introducing the Federalist role to Louisiana Purchase and laying the additional foundation that faction plays a significant role in the land programs. Can you define your faction as you would use it either right here or in general in your book?
The term faction just means group of people with a singular purpose,
Okay. That makes it easy.
political or otherwise. It's just, there's lots of different factions in the world. In fact, human beings group up into groups for our, when our interests align and we want to try to get something done. And so we gather together with other like-minded individuals to accomplish whatever that is. That's a faction by definition.
Well, I think
And
you
there
and
are
I,
some,
go ahead.
go ahead.
Sorry.
Well, I was just going to say there are some factions that are pernicious, meaning that they're looking for an outcome that has a deleterious effect on everybody else except for them. And those are the factions that took control of the system long ago.
I think you and I had a not an argument, but I had said something, and you're really good at calling me out when when you're like, it's awesome. So I'm blabbering my mouth, right? And I'm like, oh, the government had few and defined powers, and you're like, name them, and I'm like, oh, okay, so you win. I mean, I'm looking at it, and you're calling me out, and then I'm looking at the factions, and I don't know if you remember this, but it was kind of funny. I said, our founding fathers really never wanted political parties. And then you decided to be able to come in and say some other form of brilliance to, embarrass me if I was such a person. Um, about the fact that what did you say? It was brilliant. Do you remember what you said?
I
It had to
don't,
it
actually.
had to do with factions, and that's why we ended up creating a bicameral system.
Oh, yeah.
Is that
So,
what
all
you
right.
said?
Federalist number 10. Everybody should read Federalist number 10 because first of all, you have to understand what the Federalist Papers are. The Federalist Papers were the people who created the Constitution explaining what they had done.
Hmm.
It's an operator's manual. It's what it is. They're explaining this is what we did and this is why we did it, right? And they even tell you in there if you're running the system and you're seeing this error message come up, this is how you handle the error message. Okay?
Sounds
Seriously,
sounds like we should be reading that a little more often these days.
right?
And
So, okay. So, and I'll give you a pointer. I think it's Federalist 46 or 47. And it's one of the founders. I forget. It could be Madison. In fact, I think it is Madison. He's saying, look, if in the future, if you're seeing the situation where the system is moving more democratically than toward a republic, then and you notice that, then here's how you correct it.
wow.
Okay? All right.
So we don't have any excuse for why the government's running the way it does.
Nobody's reading the owner's manual.
Oh, the owner's manual.
So
That's exactly right.
it's the owner's manual, the operator's manual, right? So it
Yep.
tells us what to look for when we see this is what we do to correct it, etc. Okay.
Right.
Federalist 10. So when I was reading through the Federalist 10 to put all that together, it suddenly dawned on me in the violence of faction part of this what Madison was talking about. And it hit me like a ton of bricks. I mean, I'm sitting there, I'm almost breathless when I realize what he was saying in Federalist 10. Here's what Madison is saying in Federalist 10. There's nothing we can do about factions. They're going to exist no matter what. It's part of human nature. So we did not make a system to constrain or limit faction. It's impossible.
Hmm.
So here's what we did. We created a system that works on cosmic cause and effect variables that give the people the power to kick the bums out when they turn tyrannical.
Mm. And it's
Because
not through
here's
an
what we
Article
wanted.
5 convention, Ron?
That's right.
Huh?
That's right. That's right. It's not through an Article 5 convention. That is the in emergency break glass measure,
Right. For sure.
right?
Nice.
And and it has to be used very sparingly. Back then, if you would have used it back then, you probably could have got something done. But the people that run the system now, they could easily hijack a convention of states, no problem,
Yeah.
easy peasy.
Yeah.
They hijack everything,
Yeah.
right? So it's easy to do. um they have the whole thing is rigged. Like there's not a conversation that takes place in the United States or probably in the world that's not recorded and listened to. Okay, so you're not gonna you're you're not gonna get your agenda done in a convention of states without a high level of very organized and monetarily well funded opposition. All right, so Federalist Tip. When I realized that Madison was telling you that we created a system that works not so much to limit faction, but to we're giving these general grants of power to these people in an effort that if they're pernicious, they will hang themselves with it. It's think of this: we set a trap and we baited it with cheese. And if they're stupid enough to eat the cheese, then you kick the bums out.
And that is reliant on the knowledge and the diligence of the people as well as
So
the
these
states,
people,
right?
these factions that exist now, they said, okay, we see what Madison's done here. So how do we get around that? Well, look, if the people don't know how the system operates and they don't understand that the owner's manual, the operator's manual would tell them how to identify certain things and what they need to do about it, and if they just disconnected from it entirely, then we'll pretty much get a free reign to do whatever we please.
Well, that's a great that's important for us to be able to consider, considering what we've got going on in our legislature this session. I
People
love
don't
this.
seem to understand our system of government cannot operate without the people understanding at some level how the operator's manual what it says, right?
Hmm.
Because when the error messages come up, you got to know how to deal with them.
Hmm.
So there has to be some level of understanding. So they just take that out of the schools so that they don't have any knowledge of it whatsoever. And then you just create a system where they're not encouraged to go look into it later on in life either.
Yeah. And then you take over academia and you take over the media, and the government continues to tell you that you're a different form of government than you grew up to believe, and believes that you don't need to do anything. The only thing you need to do is vote. And I'm like, yeah,
So
if
if I
people if,
tell
if people would just
everybody
even
that
do
watches
that.
these videos, the way out of this is you go back to the owner's manual, read the owner's manual, and all the error messages that are coming up, compare it in the operator's manual, and see what the fix was for the people that wrote the manual.
I think the problem is though that then they'll have to read, Ron. And I think what the Federalist is what, probably 300 plus pages.
Uh, yeah, it's over 100 and it's over 100 and some odd.
Yeah,
Yeah,
it's my version is 634 pages. So
oh pages, yeah, but I'm just talking about individual. Like Madison wrote one. Madison wrote a whole bunch. Uh, um, Hamilton wrote a bunch,
And
right?
Jay wrote a
So, but
bunch.
there's only certain amount of papers,
There's
but in
84 of them.
pages,
Yeah.
right? Yeah, but
Well,
in
I mean, I'm just
pages, there's yeah,
if people are going to have to get to know those, and the other thing too is, if anybody's ever read, Sun Tzu's Art of War, you have to understand the enemy and you have to understand yourself. And I look at it a little bit deeper than that. It isn't just understanding your enemy because you'll have to define on who that is, but it's understanding both sides of an issue. And I think what I
right,
really things really, really started coming together for me when I read the Federalist Papers and knowing what I know right now, and then reading the Anti-Federalist Papers, which is really hardly ever mentioned. And I
right.
feel like, when they were talking in these were letters that were written to the New York Packet, I believe. But what I see is that that these guys that were creating this Constitution, they wanted to create enough of an awareness to be able to educate the people enough to be able to understand why they should support the Constitution. And then if I understand it right, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, we had the anti-federalists that are like, yeah, but what if this happens? And yeah, what if this happens? And yeah, what if this
Yes,
happens? And so,
yes.
on the radio, I'm commonly told that I'm an anti-federalist, and I would have to say that if I remember right, going through all of that, I would have to say it's not more of a matter of being one or the other. It's the ability to be able to show it almost looked like in the Federalist Papers that some of these people in their brilliance didn't really understand what was happening, and in some instances it looked like the anti-federalists did. Was that your assessment?
No, not at all.
So
See,
where am I where am I wrong on that?
okay, so it's I think that's a popular narrative because it's assumed that the Federalists didn't have any real awareness as to the power of the system they were creating, and but they did. So it's important to read the Jefferson letters to Madison.
Right.
That's important because when they sent the Constitution out for ratification, the return that they were getting from the states is, look, we're just not going to ratify this without some equilibrating agent in it,
Hmm.
right? So you have to ask yourself, what are we talking about here? What was causing the states to not ratify this document? And it's because the necessary and proper power, the commercial power, these general grants of power had no limitations, zero. And while the Anti Federalists understood the reason why, they're like, we understand that. And we're sort of kind of willing to at least contemplate this with you because you're right. That is human nature. Yes. Violence of faction and all that. Got it. You're right. Can't. They weren't going to tell Madison he was outside of his mind because they knew he wasn't.
Hmm.
But they were like, just giving these general grants of power, it just doesn't sit well with us. There's got to be an equilibrating force. So Thomas Jefferson sends a letter to Madison, espousing the virtue of a Bill of Rights. And he says, look, I think we made a huge error in not understanding that the people are the ones who are going to suffer here in the exercise of these general grants of power if this system ever turns tyrannical. That's where it's going to manifest. We have to give the people some level of a way out, some level of a defense.
Hmm.
Okay. So Madison reads Jefferson's letter and says, man, you're right. Sends back a letter, says, you're right. I see this now. I don't know why I missed it because I was thinking about things a certain way, but yeah, I think you're right. So they created the Bill of Rights to act as that equilibrating force against the necessary and proper power and the excessive exercise of the commercial power. So now we have to stop for a minute. We have to ask, what is the necessary and proper power used for? The necessary and proper power is the constitutional authority for the delegation of federal authority which creates all of the administrative agencies,
To perform the
all of
powers
them.
that they were the delegated powers that they were given.
Yeah. So instead of the Congress having to leave their building and go, you know, go to a truck weighing station themselves and weigh all these trucks to make sure that the law that they passed that the trucks can't be above a certain weight, right? So that they're just outsourcing that power to an administrator who makes sure that these trucks that are traveling the country are adhering to the regulations that they have set.
So
But
I have
even the
something to, and it had something to do with some a piece of legislation from that I've been seeing this week, and that is the healthcare amendments. There's a healthcare bill. They want to be able to give, these districts all powers, right? So I'm naturally saying, okay, well, this is just really timely considering, the World Health Organization is trying to demand that all of these amendments are created. And so it seems like some of the Liberty folks that were down at the legislature were like, oh, things are really great. We put in this necessary and proper clause. And I thought, oh my gosh, here we go again. So the point is you and I already know what the necessary and proper clause can mean. The arbitrary nature of it, the ease of expansion and things. But the question that I wanted to get you on right now is who controls the limits of the what is necessary and what is proper?
question, um,
We do, right? I mean,
we haven't done it. We haven't done it. The
it,
United States citizenry, we checked out a long time ago, dude. We don't do anything.
but my point is that when it comes to uh, those types of powers that are not specifically defined, it's it goes back to the principle of self-governance and personal
Yes,
responsibility, and it's a
that's
republic if
right.
you can keep it. And
That's
if
right.
you're derelict and you don't know that or the operator's manual, you can't possibly, determine anything that's necessary or proper, and you're going to end up being left to having your rights given to you by your government, which is another violation of one of our, foundational principles and whatever. So I just wanted to make sure that I
100%.
hammered that out. The other thing,
100%.
we're coming into, I think we got till we got till 3 o'clock. So we got 20 more minutes. Unless you want to shut earlier. The what I really
No,
liked
we're
was
good. This is rolling.
you were starting on the I think that was the first mention, maybe, of the vassal state arrangement. And since you mentioned that a lot throughout the rest of the book, if you haven't defined it already, I thought that I might ask you again to help refresh uh, viewers and listeners' understanding of what you mean by that.
Sure. Okay. So when you look up the term vassal state, its actual meaning is a vassal state in any state that has a mutual obligation to a superior state or an empire in a status similar to that of a vassal in the feudal system in medieval Europe. It's often equated with the feudal system, right? Um, so the we have to talk about what the ramifications are, were, and are of the United States government not creating enabling legislation for the Louisiana territories westward.
Can I just jump in real quick
Ra-
before you do that?
yes, please go.
The one thing I wanted to do is just to make sure that people have a concrete understanding. And so sometimes I'll throw out something to sort of clarify it for simpletons like myself. So a vassal state arrangement for me would indicate that we have a superior and we have an inferior, right? And so the
Yes,
vassal state, the entity that is the vassal state is the apparent inferior to the superior. In this particular
yes,
instance, the federal government is the superior entity, and the states themselves are vassal states. Otherwise, they're taking an inferior position, which would sort of fly in the face of people's, you know, 10th Amendment sovereignty, type of a type of a mindset. Is that right?
Yeah, so the
Sorry.
no, no, this is good. This is good. These are good questions because they have to be answered. They have to be answered, and there are answers here. Okay, they're not. I people aren't going to like them. They're not going to like the answers.
We're not here to please folks, man.
Okay, so I'm only here to tell you what they did. I'm not telling you that I agree, disagree. I'm just here to tell you what they did and how it exists now. That's all I'm here to do. Okay. So the way that the system is supposed to operate is that the states and the federal government are supposed to be supreme in their sphere. That the government, when it is discharging one of its constitutional powers, it's got an exclusive right to discharge that power according to the Constitution, and that the state has an exclusive right to discharge its power in relation to its Constitution and its powers, right? Okay. That scheme works if you have a state that is under complete control of the state and a federal government that is limited in the way that it can apply power in the state. But in the 11 Western states, where at least 50% of the state's landmass is controlled and owned by the federal government, the scheme is very, very, very different, right? Because you're not exercising 10th Amendment power
Not
on the map
50%.
that you see,
Mhm.
right? On that whole panhandle, Idaho looks like a gun, that geographic boundary thing. The state of Idaho is not applying 10th Amendment power to the whole thing. It's just not. It's only applying 10th Amendment power as if dots are on the map. And every one of the dots is an area where the state of Idaho applies 10th Amendment power.
Has
In
that been
that scenario, you have a vassal state arrangement.
perfect? I think that that's well done, man. Um, so now that we understand what that type of arrangement is, I think in my view, it helps us see things more clearly because, or maybe I'm wrong, but does it seem that the vassal state program has not only become more evident, but it's become more, I don't want to say extreme, just more, it's become more evident, right? I mean,
It is
it's
because it's
because the
you have
federal
cause and
government,
effect.
right? So you have the federal government that's growing in power, right, and authority and control, and you've got the states. The more powerful the federal government gets, the states are like, "Oh, just give me my money." You know what I mean? And
Right.
so that really has sort of maybe you just say it's widened the chasm, maybe, or I guess if you will. Um,
Well, the best way to look at it is cause and effect. All right. So everything in this world works on cause and effect. Everything. Right. So you take a situation and you map it all out, you create a simulation and you run it, and the underlying principles in the code of a computer simulation, the underlying principles and how it's mapped out are going to create a system of variables. It's going to spit them out. And that's your effect. So you got your cause, then you got your effect. Okay.
mhm.
Now I'm going to do a little correlation. Take the system federalism that we have, which is the constitutional system creates a federalist system, a federalism, and that is your computer code. That's the operating system. Okay. So if you have a federalism operating system, it's going to operate and it's going to kick out things a certain way. If you alter that code and make it run on a different operating system over time, you're going to get a different effect. You're going to get a different effect. Cause and effect. This is the cause, that's the effect. All you got to do is change the operating system. Did they do that? Yes, they did. How did they do that? The ownership principle over the lands, which started at the Louisiana Purchase, manifested in the Federal Lands Policy Management Act of 1976, and from then till now, we've been under what's called cooperative federalism. So it changed the operating system, and now all the effects are what you see now.
Okay. So now that we're talking about federalism, there are some organizations that will talk about federalism. They'll define federalism. They will talk about dual federalism versus some other federalism. I guess I don't really know.
Cooperative.
Well,
If it's
it's
not cooperative, they don't know what they're talking about.
so if it's, but so I guess to help people define these terms that have been stuck, that have been learning this kind of a thing. Are you saying that so cooperative? I understand what the cooperative is because that would help me believe that it's a relational aspect between two things. But so we have a dual federalism component, right?
Yeah.
And we have,
Well, I
and
don't know what you mean by that.
I
Are you
know
talking
that's
about, do we have that now?
well, yeah. I mean, and that's the funny thing too, because it goes into, whether it was that way now or was actually defined to be able to do that. And I think it's important that regardless of what something is called, kind of like how you define federalism throughout the book, it's kind of fun, especially when you get to the end. But is to be able to understand that the states had constitutions and the federal government had constitutions, and they were both created for certain purposes. And, never the two shall cross, I guess. Is that a fair thing to say?
You can look at it that way. You can look at
And
it this way too. Look at state power and federal power, and consider it a slider. You got state power, federal power. You got the slider, right?
mhm,
So what you're trying to get in a dual federal model is the slider's right here in the middle at 50%. But what the government's done because of its land program is it slid the slider more toward the federal end.
yeah, that's well done. That's really good. So you've made mention, let's see, you've made several mentions to the book. There's also a reference here if anybody wants it. It's called The Reports of the Law of Civil Government in Territory Occupied by the Military Forces of the United States, as submitted by Elihu Root and Charles Magoon. Um, uh, I'm not really, as I went through it, I kind of skipped through it. I didn't really recognize the significance of that. Is there something that people need to know about that specifically? I know that you
Yeah,
go
there's a
into
lot they need to know.
the people, you go into the military reports after the Spanish-American War and all that. And I don't think when people are doing research that they would ever think about going into the military report. So can you kind of take us from, if you understand where I'm at, talking about that?
Yeah, because you missed in the reports where they talked about the Civil War.
I
That's
probably
what you
did.
should have paid attention to. Yeah.
Okay.
And the reason why is because the southern states at the close of the Civil War were under territorial rule. They had lost their Confederate status and they were under territorial rule. And the minute they were under territorial rule, they were in the vassal state program.
Wow. Um, then we go into what you had talked about with the question that kind of looms throughout the thing is that the Constitution might not extend into the territories.
Yeah, so in the debates in Congress, the question was, does the Constitution follow the flag, meaning where the United States military goes with its flag and does conquest and this sort of thing? Or we, through a treaty, purchase some property, some territory, or acquire it in any other way where the United States flag goes? Does the Constitution follow that flag? And the the result of the debates in Congress was no.
So, in simple terms, what does that tell
That's
us
as
about
simple as you can make it.
what
Now
what
it's
is that?
complicated because you don't know how to think it through. The
Right.
people don't know how to think that through. But so let me come at it a different way. What they're saying is if the United States acquires territory, does the Constitution apply to it immediately? No, it does
And there
not.
it is. You need to say that one more time because it's very important and
If the
nobody I know
United States
says that.
if the United States acquires territory, does the United States Constitution apply to it automatically? The debate The outcome of the debate was no, no, it does not. It didn't from the beginning of the land program, and it didn't in 1838 when they had that discussion in Congress. No, no, no.
So is it easy to say in blanket terms, or would it be ignorant to say that that rights may not be extended to citizens on federal land?
So again, we go back to the guarantee of private rights. This is the United States versus Dore.
Mhm.
And they were discussing, okay, so these courts, these Article 1 territorial courts in Guam and Puerto Rico and all Virgin Islands and this thing, um, what's the deal there? These do these people have private rights that they can assert in a court case legally? And the district court, the territorial court was like, not unless they're incorporated. So then you got to go, well, what's incorporated and what's not? That's hard. That's that's been difficult to figure out. The United States government's not going to just give you that. Why? Because if it has ambiguity as to whether or not things are incorporated, they can kind of just work with impunity. How are you going to stop them?
And
It's
we
the
would
werewolf game.
and we would consider unincorporated as anything that isn't a state.
Well, let's stop right there. If the United States acquires territory, does the Constitution immediately follow? No.
No, right. But if it's been incorporated, what actually defines incorporation? Is it once they become a
They
state
don't
or
say. They don't say.
which is
So
what
Rasmussen versus United States. There was a issue in the court in Alaska in the Rasmussen case in which this guy's like, "Hey man, I'm not getting a jury trial here in this administrative court hearing." And so he challenged the fact that he wasn't getting a jury trial, wasn't even offered to him. And so he lost at the Alaska District Court because you always lose the lower court because they almost never get it right. So he appealed it and eventually gets to the United States Supreme Court. In the United Supreme Court, in Rasmussen's decision, they said this: when we went and read the acquisition of Alaska and the treaty with Russia, Russia in the treaty specifically mandated that the Alaska territory be incorporated. It used the word incorporated. I went, oh crap. So let me look at the Oregon Treaty that got Washington, Oregon, and Montana. Guess what I didn't find?
articles of incorporation.
I did not find the word incorporation.
So what was Russia's in what was going on in Russia's mind when they made that when they requested that or mandated that, you think?
They knew about the law of incorporation.
And we're in our country and we're not even reading our owner's manual.
Keep in mind that the judge in the Downs versus Bidwell case, in his dissenting opinion, he said this idea of incorporation has some sort of an occult meaning I can't wrap my mind around.
Well, cult meaning that's pretty strong coming from
Well,
the
the
Supreme
word
Court.
occult just means hidden. That's all it means. Hidden. Occult means hidden.
Yeah, but it's still yeah. Well, we're
Yeah, it has a connotation. Yeah.
so we're up at 2:57, so we got just a couple minutes left. I think so far we're on page 19. You left off with a taken from a congressional record, some quote by Mr. Calhoun relating to the simple question about whether the Constitution extends to the territories or does it. And so that was a pretty good explanation there, Ron. So are we? Let's I think let's probably just, unless you had any final thoughts or comments about that, let's try to wrap that up and we can go ahead and pick up from page 20 tomorrow, if that works. Does that sound okay?
Yeah, that'll work. Yeah.
Okay.
Yep.
So, Anyway, you guys, if you're interested, you guys, I hate to say that, sorry, ladies and gentlemen, if you're interested in anything that has been said today, we encourage you to follow us on the series. We would hope that this will empower you to purchase the book. That means purchase the book, and use this as an accompaniment as you read the book, because what we're talking about in the video just isn't enough. There's just too much good information in there. You've got to read it yourself. You've got to highlight it. You got to go through the work to do it. It's really, really important. You're going to have a perspective that very, very few people have. I don't think anybody has, maybe except you and me and maybe a couple of other folks. So it makes me feel rather unique and special, which is wonderful. But as we begin to gain some ground and doing some, interviews with people and to try to get the word out, since everything today is so relevant and your book is so timely with just about every issue that we can see in the news. I had openly said that I'm gonna keep tethering to you, man, until you until you're until you're impossible to reach. But Ron, I appreciate the work that you've done on the book. I think our fellow Idahoans and our fellow Americans should really we should really be thanking you for the masterpiece that you've created here and bringing an awareness that literally nobody else has, I don't think, at least the way that you've done it. And so my last plea is to go buy the book. Um, Send Ron a message on his contact page on the history of federal lands in the United States.com. The link will be in the comment box. We are going to be picking up from page 20 the next time we meet. And so we'll continue to go through the series as long as we can. Hopefully, we make it to the end. And by that time, we should reach superstar status, right, Ron?
Man, I hope so. It's been a long road, brother.
Well, and it's important that people listen that it's not about the superstar status. It's just about giving people the information that they need to be able to make so that they can make good decisions. It's a great way to be able to go back and help people understand the importance of reading their owner's manual and caring enough to be able to do something about it. And hopefully this empowers them to do that. So until next time, Ron, I want to thank you for joining me, man, and I look forward to seeing you next time.
Thanks for having me, Tom. See you next time.
Okay.